You're crouched beside a small fire and the wind hasn't stopped for 3 days. It's somewhere around 50,000 years ago, deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Your fingers are numb, and in your hands is something almost nobody would look at twice. A sliver of bone, no bigger than a toothpick, with a hole drilled through one end so small you'd need to squint to find it. Here's the strange part. That tiny object in your hands is going to matter more than the fire in front of you, more than the spear leaning against the wall. Some researchers would argue it matters more than almost anything else your species ever made. So why would something this small decide whether your family lives through the winter? Zoom out for a second. You're not just cold. You're living inside one of the harshest environments a human being has ever survived. Somewhere far to the west, ice sheets taller than a 15-story building are sitting on top of land that will eventually be called Canada and Scandinavia. Between those ice sheets stretches a strip of open, treeless grassland, the Mammoth Steppe, running nearly 6,000 miles from Spain all the way to Alaska. No trees to block the wind, no caves for hundreds of miles in most places. And on a bad night, the temperature drops past -30. Most people picture Ice Age humans huddled in caves, wrapped in animal skins like a blanket thrown over their shoulders. That's not what happened. Think about that for a second. A blanket doesn't stop wind. Wind finds every gap, every loose edge, and pulls the warmth straight off your skin. If you're walking for hours a day chasing a herd across open ground, a draped fur is basically useless. What you actually need is something closer to a modern winter coat, fitted, sealed at the seams, built to trap warm air against your body instead of letting it leak out. And that's what the needle in your hands is for. Now picture a laboratory. Tens of thousands of years later, a team of researchers is examining that exact fragment of bone from Denisova Cave, running it through dating equipment, and the number that comes back stops them for a second. Roughly 50,000 years old. One of the oldest sewing needles ever found on Earth. Not a hook, not a notch to loop thread around, an actual drilled eye, the same basic design as the needle in your grandmother's sewing kit, which raises a bigger question. If people were sewing fitted, windproof clothing 50,000 years ago, what else have we been getting wrong about them? But a needle alone doesn't keep you alive. You still have to eat. And here's where things get interesting, because not all food is equal in a place this cold. Imagine you're a hunter, and you finally corner a reindeer at the end of a long, lean winter. It's been surviving on nothing for months. And so is its body fat. You kill it anyway because you're desperate. Here's the surprising part. Eating that animal can actually leave you worse off. Your body, trying to survive extreme cold, is burning fat for fuel. If all you're feeding it is lean meat, you can starve with a full stomach. It's a real condition, sometimes called rabbit starvation, so the hunters who lasted weren't chasing whatever they could catch. They were targeting back fat before the first snow, marrow packed inside long bones, the dense fat behind a mammoth's eye. Food wasn't just food. It was fuel that let you sit still long enough and warm enough to keep sewing. Which brings us to fire. And this is where it gets genuinely clever. Try lighting a fire with numb hands, wet wood, and a wind that won't quit. Flint and stone alone won't do it. What actually worked was a fungus, a brown, hoof-shaped growth called amadou that grows on birch trees. Sliced thin, pounded until it feels like felt, then partly scorched, it catches a spark and holds it as a slow, glowing coal instead of a flame. Strike that spark off a lump of iron pyrite, and the temperature briefly spikes past 800 degrees Celsius, more than hot enough, with the right tinder, to start an ember you could carry for hours inside a hollow bone, or a closed shell. Neanderthals were already doing this before modern humans even arrived in the region. Now imagine carrying a single glowing coal across a frozen landscape for an entire day, protecting it like it's the only thing standing between your family and the dark. In a lot of ways it was. Everything up to this point was just the setup. Because staying alive for one winter isn't the hard part. Staying alive for generations is, and that meant knowing things that no single person could figure out alone, like exactly when the herds would show up. In southwestern France, archaeologists studying a set of notched antlers from a site called Abri Blanchard noticed something odd. The notches weren't random. They were spaced out in a rhythm that matched something. And eventually, the pattern clicked. It was tracking the phases of the moon, a calendar carved into bone more than 20,000 years old. Miss the timing by even a week, and the caribou passed through the valley without you. Now picture walking into a house that shouldn't exist. In Ukraine, at a site called Mezhirish, archaeologists uncovered circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bone, skulls stacked as a foundation, jawbones layered like bricks, ribs curved overhead into a dome, the whole thing wrapped in hide and pegged down with ivory, roughly 15,000 years old. Underneath the floor, pits dug into the permafrost worked exactly like a freezer, keeping meat edible through the leanest stretch of winter. This wasn't a cave. Somebody designed this, and none of it worked without other people. In western Russia, at a site called Tsunghir, archaeologists digging in the 20th century found something that stopped them cold. Two children, buried head to head, dressed in clothing sewn with an estimated 10,000 ivory beads. Work like that doesn't happen in a day. It takes a community, months of labor for a burial. And here's the part that changes the story. Beads with that exact same size and drill pattern start turning up in settlements hundreds of kilometers away. That's not decoration. That's closer to a passport. Proof that you belong to a network of people who are obligated to feed you when your own valley runs out of food. Most people assume Ice Age survival came down to individual toughness. It didn't. It came down to who you knew. But here's where the entire story changes, and it's the part almost nobody expects. The coldest nights weren't the ones that killed people. It was the warm ones. Picture your shelter on a night when the temperature suddenly rises. It sounds like good news. It isn't. Normally, warm air rises up through the smoke hole and pulls fresh air in behind it. That constant flow is what keeps your fire breathable. But when the air outside gets warmer than the air inside, that flow stops. Smoke that should be rising just hangs there, at head height, where you're sleeping. And carbon monoxide has no smell at all. A fire that's been burning safely for weeks can turn dangerous in a single, still, wet night, and nobody in the room would know until it was too late. The families who survived learned to read that shift, cracking a low vent to force fresh air across the floor, banking the fire down to a dim bed of coals instead of a flame. Small habits, the difference between a house that wakes up and one that doesn't. And the danger wasn't only in the air, it was in your own clothes. Work hard on a mild, slushy day, and you sweat straight into your fur. Sounds harmless. Except when the temperature snaps back down, sometimes 20 degrees within a few hours. That trapped moisture refreezes against your skin and starts pulling heat out of your body faster than any fire can put it back in. So people kept a second set of clothing, bone dry, sealed inside an oiled hide bag, untouched no matter how tired or cold they were, save for the exact moment the freeze returned. It sounds almost ceremonial. It wasn't superstition, it was survival physics, understood by people who never wrote a single word down. From here, the pace of change picks up. In the Czech Republic, at a site called Dolní Věstonice, researchers found the oldest known kiln on Earth, nearly 29,000 years old, used to fire small clay figures at temperatures hot enough to turn soft clay brittle and permanent. A few thousand years later, hunters in France started carving spear throwers, essentially mechanical arm extensions that let a dart fly fast enough to take down a mammoth from a safer distance. Something like the prehistoric version of upgrading from a sling to a rifle. And in Germany, at a site called Bonn Oberkassel, archaeologists found a young man, a woman, and a dog buried together roughly 14,200 years ago. Not a wolf, a dog, bred for tameness, generations in the making, sleeping at the feet of the people it would spend its whole life warning and protecting. And then, about 12,900 years ago, a volcano called Lacher See erupted in what's now western Germany and buried the region in ash for hundreds of kilometers. For the people living in its path, everything they'd built over 40,000 years, the sewn clothing, the fat targeted hunts, the bone calendars, the bead network stretching across the continent, even the dogs, became the reason they could pack up an entire shelter in a day and simply walk somewhere safer, not scatter, not collapse, move together, like they'd rehearsed it their whole lives, because in a way, they had. Go back for a second to that woman by the fire with the needle in her hands. She has no idea any of this is coming. She doesn't know about the volcano, or the beads, or the calendar carved on an antler 2 valleys over. All she knows is that the hole in this needle has to be small enough, and clean enough, that the thread won't tear the seam when the wind hits it tonight. Maybe that's the real story here. Not the ice, or the mammoths, or the fire. It's that somewhere, right now, you probably have your own version of that needle. Some small, careful habit you barely think about. That's quietly the reason everything else holds together.